Hey everyone, my name is Kenzie Dodds, and I'm super excited to be joined by my friend Michael Chan. Say hi, Michael.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, good. Hey, you may have listened to the podcast already, or maybe not, but Michael is the interviewer or the
Yes.
host of the podcast, and now I get to talk to Michael, and I'm excited to swap this around a little bit. Uh,
It's good because I know that like halfway through, you were kind of like, this feels a little bit uncomfortable. Like you just asking me questions like over and over again.
yeah, I wanted
So
I
this
wanted
is
to peek
fun.
into your mind a little bit. So yeah, that's I'm glad that we get to do this.
Yeah, I'm happy to open it to you.
Very good. Cool. Michael, I'm with everybody that I talk with, and I'm introducing them, to the audience like we're buddies. I always like to go back and say, I've known this person for X amount of time. Like this is where we first met. And I think that the first time we met was at React Rally, like early, or maybe it was React Conf, like the second React Conf is the one I went to. I
Oh
don't
man, that's
remember.
a good question. I don't really know either. I mean, like I think that we were aware of each other probably via, online via Twitter.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. React Rally? Maybe that seems weird.
I think it was either one of those conferences for sure.
Yeah, I don't remember a time meeting you actually.
Yeah, it's just kind of like we knew each other. so,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's been a while, maybe like 5 years or something like that. We've
Yep.
known each other for quite a while, maybe four. Yeah. And we were both into React the whole time. So React brought us together.
It
Um,
did.
like so many of my friends.
If there's
um,
one thing that I'm pleased about, it's that we met because of it.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So, why don't you introduce yourself to us and let us get to know you a little bit, and then we'll get to chatting.
Yeah, so my name is Michael Chan, and I go by Chantastic just about everywhere. Um, it's kind of funny actually. Like I, I don't know. Like you use your real name for your moniker, and like I use a different one, and I feel like I'm having like a little bit of like an identity crisis. Like some people will call me Michael, and it sounds really weird, and then other people will call me like Chantastic, and it feels really weird. And I don't know. It's like
I can
split
actually
brain thing.
relate to that because my middle initial is kind of like branding. Like that is
Yeah.
me, and I actually even on my info page that I send to conferences, I say this is how you say my name, and this is how you don't say my name, and the C is very important in there. And so when I go to like church or with my family or like anybody outside of the tech world, to have them say Kent Dodds is so weird.
Oh, for
It's
sure.
almost like
Yeah.
rating. It's like that's not how you're supposed to say it, but but I know that I'm wrong in thinking that.
It's true. Yeah. Kent C. Dodds. It's like all one word, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's like Etsy, like Kentsy.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
so I was actually trying to think about how long I've been doing some type of programming now, and it's been a while. I mean, like probably like 15 years, maybe, a little bit longer. I dabbled in some stuff, but yeah, and I've been doing that. I started with like PHP and, all that stuff. I fell in love with CSS pretty early on, just because it's weird, kind of like it's just super weird, but I love how like painfully declarative it is. I'm gonna say painfully declarative. Like I love how painfully declarative it is, and for all its faults, it's kind of like my first love in like web languages. So
Hmm.
yeah, I just really fell in love with that kind of front end development after that, and you know um, I really wanted to get into products, and so JavaScript was kind of like just taking off around the time that I was actually getting into programming languages, and so JavaScript, React after that, and yeah, I kind of pressed the advantage with like early React and started just making some React source resources and host React podcast, which is kind of like my biggest kind of non-work project to date.
Hmm. Yeah, React podcast. If anybody listening hasn't subscribed to React podcast, strongly advise do
Thank you.
that, and even like go back and start from the beginning. I've done this before, where a podcast you have like over 100, maybe 200 episodes, right?
Yeah. Over 100. We're getting close to 110 as of this
Yeah.
recording right
Okay.
now.
Yeah. So I've definitely jumped on podcasts when they were past like 200 and listened to it all. And and this is definitely accomplishable for React Podcast and worthwhile, I think. Um,
Well, thanks. And
kind of,
if you do listen, you'll hear Kent on there a couple times. We talk. I think maybe one of our first actual conversations was at React Reality. Just kind of like talking about your talk that year and what you've been learning about React. And I think maybe uh, Downshift maybe was what you
yeah.
were
Yep.
working on at the time. Maybe.
Yeah. Because I was speaking about Simply React was the title of the talk,
Yeah.
and Downshift was kind of it was where I learned all the things that I was teaching in that talk. So yeah, it's good times. Yeah, definitely a good podcast. And I want to make sure that you talk about React Christmas.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah.
like, well, there's another one that you've got about like the fundamentals of React. I forget what it's called.
Oh yeah. I have a site that so I have a couple resources. One of the most popular is React Patterns, and it's
Right.
basically like a short, like one paragraph of each pattern. So like render props, order component, whatever. And it's like that was kind of like your downshift experience. That was kind of like me trying to understand like what all of these things are, and like if I could write succinctly what it was and how to use it in like a paragraph in one snippet of code. So there's that. And then every year around Christmas time, I try to do like an advent calendar. And I think it's at like react.holiday.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll remember, in December when it comes around again. But yeah, it's this like daily thing, and it's super fun. I think my goal last year was just to go from like, writing, 30 or I guess 25 20-minute videos, and I wanted to cover all of the like major stuff in React. And so we start from like just how to render a div and get all the way to like hooks and like touching in on suspense and error boundaries. And I was just amazed at how much we can cover in just like 2 minutes over like 25 days. And I don't know, I just love like boiling things down to just these like tiny little minuscule lessons.
Mm-hmm.
um I don't know, that's neither here nor there, but yeah. So coming up Christmas time, react.holiday.
Yeah, it's great. I love it. So sweet. That's good to know you, Michael. So
Thank
we're
you.
gonna you have one of the actually, let's see. I don't think it was on your React Patterns thing. I think maybe this is something else, but I remember on one of the resources that you've got, you talk about how to make these components that encapsulate their styling
Oh yeah.
properties.
Yep.
Um, and in your example, you're using classes, like just regular classes, and how that is a really nice abstraction for just, we talk about styled components, CSS and JS, but really all of that stuff is implementation detail. So it doesn't matter whether you're using CSS and JS or regular class names. At the end of the day, I'm just using the component and I just render that component. I expect that it will apply the right styles based on the props that I give it and whatever.
Yep.
And maybe the only difference here is that I have to make sure that the CSS is on the page. But in certain scenarios, that just happens naturally. So it doesn't really matter what the implementation is. So anyway, that really spoke to me. Or this was years ago that I remember seeing this, and I was like, yeah, that totally makes sense. I'm on board with that idea. So I'd love to just open up our conversation to have you talk about how you think about styling in a React application context.
Yeah. I think that resource might be, it's like learnreact.com. It's like very
Yeah.
out of date, and like I do plan on like making again. But yeah, it was like my exploration of like function components, and like the whole goal was to write components that I guess like gave some type of like API around like how you would render a button. I think we focused on a button the whole time,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
and how you would render a button. And my goal was at the end of it to be able to switch out the implementation of like whether it was going to be Bootstrap or I don't know. There's a ton of them now, right? But basically be able to hot swap underneath the hood like what these the implementation or the CSS styling implementation that these components were targeting to kind of demonstrate like this is a really amazing way to kind of like encapsulate an API that you use everywhere, but then don't have to think about like the styling underneath.
Yeah,
And
yeah, money right there. That's good. That is good stuff. This is what we love about React is
yeah.
like how easy it makes doing that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, you know, at the time it's like I even used the word like function components. I think now in React they're just components, right? We're trying to get away from the notion that there was ever a class component.
Yeah.
But the I think for me it was like really fun to just explore like the boundaries of these things, like how you compose them together, how you think about them, you know. And I, since the, you know, beginning, I've always done this really weird thing where like I have like a basic button implementation and I'll make, you know, like the API I always see for this is like the danger button or the success button or whatever. Like I'll make those different components, right? Like I don't have one like God object component ever that like knows how to make all these different types of buttons and how the sizes are and all that kind of stuff. No, like I have always had just like one basic button that applies basic styling and then a bunch of other buttons that kind of like compose or abstract over that and compose with like other notions of buttons. And I don't know, we could talk about composition like all day, but like
yeah, for real. Like, you know, there's composition of the components, and then there's composition of the hooks, and just
yeah.
React is just a bucket of composition. But yeah, I'd love to get into a little deeper into how you do this at scale at a company, where you have like lots of engineers who, I mean, so many companies so many, I've worked at 4 companies, and so maybe not so many, but like, pretty much every company that I've worked at did not have a great way to make sure that the team X over here is building and working on these buttons that are consistent with our style.
Yep.
Team Y over here is they're actually doing the exact same thing, you know, making their own buttons that are still consistent. And then you look at them and they're like, that's not quite the same. And so like they're
Totally.
doubling work and they're still not being successful at it. So how do you avoid that kind of a problem at scale with styling components?
Yeah. So I think about it almost completely opposite, right? Like, so I am a little bit of a nihilist. I don't know, like, I don't know if there's a term for me, like maybe like a faithful nihilist or like whatever, because I still like, I still, you know, believe in like a God and that, but like also like I kind of believe that like things are maybe beyond repair in most cases.
Okay.
So that definitely plays out in the way that I think about code. And one of the things that I have spent a lot of my career doing is exactly what you are talking about in this space where you have a lot of teams working autonomously, building up different things. And there's always this notion that eventually we can kind of create some type of abstraction that is complete and thorough and just aggressively opinionated so that everything will always look consistent and the same everywhere. And I don't believe that's possible. Like, I just don't believe in it. I don't think it's possible. And so I have this, I don't know, maybe it's a personality disorder or whatever, but like when I run up against a wall, like my inclination naturally is to run in the exact opposite direction. So like I know that like this thing's not possible. I know that we're never going to have like perfect consistency, that there's never going to be a perfect design system that can implement all of the nuances of, you know, what each page needs to do in every circumstance. So for me, I like running the opposite direction. And for me, the question is, how can we do a really good job at exception handling? How can we make systems that are able to, what's the best way to put it? Like, how can we think about things in such a way that it's like nothing is ever going to be consistent, and like and like how can we make it easier to get to consistency instead of thinking that like one day we're just going to like bulldoze everything over everything and it'll be consistent? Because you and I both know that that's not the way that technology works. It's not the way that design works, right? Every year there's some kind of new hotness, some type of new thing that everyone's super excited about, and then we're like, we're going to rebuild everything with that. And it's like, now you have like, your app is always 50 pockets of differing technology.
We're going to build everything with that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, and the best example of this is like, you go to like any of the like major frameworks, like JavaScript frameworks websites, and you will see the same companies listed as like users of that thing.
That's true.
Right. And so, I mean, I see this in kind of like a small way where like all of, you know, the system that I work on is basically 10 discrete apps run by 10 different like autonomous teams, right? And they, what is it? They're all some mix of Rails and React. Some are like 99% React, others are like 99% Rails. And so I'm always fascinated in something that will, I have this belief that like if we can build tools today that can that work with what we have today and what we thought was the hotness 10 years ago, that those things will kind of stand the test of time and like actually like kind of like move gracefully forward to the next 10 years. So like I'm on those slow solutions. Like I'm not about like whatever's hot on Hacker News right now. Like I want like the standards. I love standards like CSS, JavaScript, just like the basics. So yeah, I'm all about that. I don't know if I even said anything in that. It was
no,
just like a mental mix of ideas.
Yeah, so I see that like I guess a pessimistic view or maybe a realistic view of the fact that we can't be 100% consistent. And I think I understand why that is, but I would like to dig into that a little bit and maybe push back just a bit. So let's assume that you're at a company and everybody's using React.
Mm-hmm.
So why couldn't I just build a button or a set of button components and then say, well, if you want to render a button, you've got to render this. That would give me consistency, you know, and this is where we get into having, you know, company component libraries and that sort of thing. So what is the what are some of the pitfalls that you see with just making a component library that everybody uses and now we're consistent?
Yeah. So something that I notice a lot is that, you know, we build a lot of these design systems and kind of these really like hard ideas around certain notions of user experiences and like, you know, UIs that will be built with these things. However, so often these things get kind of like shifted just a little bit, right? Where, you know, maybe you use, you know, 16 pixels as like your base font size for like most of your UI. But then you have this one little like sidebar thing and you don't want the whole thing to be like 16 pixels, but like you just want it all kind of like squished it down a little bit, right? But like that means that you're, you know, you put it at 14 pixels and now that kind of changes everything, right? Like your avatars are going to change, your inputs are going to change, like everything shifts just a little bit. And like in order to make the design right, you kind of have to like break that system, right? Or make a system that's effectively two systems anyway, right? Like you have like the system that's 16 pixels and the 14 pixel system. And then when you have a larger thing, you got to have like the 18 pixel version of all that kind of stuff. And like all of your avatars are just, you know, an exponent of like how many versions you have. And I think that, you know, I identified as a designer, and I think that, you know, there's a reason that like you go onto like a Bootstrap site and you're like, oh, this is a Bootstrap site, right? Like,
yeah, for real.
Right? It was designed for internal tools. Like that's the reason that they made Bootstrap, was to like make these internal tools. And like internal tools are not like polished bastions of like beautiful design and user experience. They're like very utilitarian. And I think that this is something that is not often considered in very opinionated design systems. That, you know, it's designed for like some kind of like beautiful mathematical working of, you know, exactly the font size that you're aware of. But even, you know, if you look at your personal homepage for GitHub, you'll notice that like most of it is set in like a certain kind of, you know, font size, but then the sidebars are like a little bit different. This is like a perfect example of like these things where like the whole UI adjusts a little bit. And so for that reason, I kind of don't think about like a single design system, right? But I think about atomic elements, like components that can be anything, and then having a number of systems that you would use, whether that be, for a single view, or like a set of views, or like a collection of experiences, that these would have a system that's like kind of like consistent for itself, or consistent for like a certain part of the UI. But that these things actually like have a relationship, like a decoupled relationship with like the actual atomic elements themselves. And I don't know, I love CSS custom properties for this, but you could really achieve it in anything. Like, as you said earlier, the browser doesn't care, and your users definitely don't care.
Yeah, sure. But I'd love to dig into several things like that, like why what's so hot about CSS custom properties,
Mhm.
as well as kind of like more taking a step back on like what the heck even is a design system and a component library, and in particular, like what are you working on day to day to enable engineers to be effective with these things? So whichever one of those directions you want to
Oh
take
my
off.
gosh. Yeah, so let's see if we can knock some of those out, because I feel like I've just kind of like blabbered on for a little bit. But um, I think, as a designer, I think it's super odd that like design systems has been like co-opted to mean like React component libraries. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think that it's important to know that like there's so design systems exist like everywhere, right? Like you could have design systems that mandate like how architecture is done, or like print is done, and all that. And I think that you can have a design system and no components, and components and no design system. And I think that being able to separate the two can give us a little bit more freedom, I think, and being able to like implement like a design system for like this kind of layout, or for print, or for our admin versus our user facing versus marketing. um, and I think that like having that separation of like the notion of like components, and being able to kind of like place design systems onto them, if that makes sense, um, is like a really like powerful notion. So when you separate those two things, that's awesome. So yeah, that's design systems versus component
So would
libraries.
you say that like a design system is what's the deliverable? Like if I were to say, okay, Michael, I am going to give you 6 weeks to go work on our design system.
Yeah.
What do you give back to me when you're done?
Yeah, so that's really interesting, because a lot of times the design system will talk about some of those boundaries in like in the exception handling, right? Like it'll say like, hey, this usually presents like this, right? Like our avatars are always 32 pixels by default, right? But then you have a situation where like maybe you have you're putting it inside of, I don't know, just for the sake of example, you put it inside of an input, right? And now like you don't have like another size for that. Like, so what is this thing? Like it's just something that's like outside of your design system. Well, it might be outside of your component library, like that might not have a solution for it yet, but like your design system should have considerations for that. Like, hey, in this type of environment where it's 14 pixels, we actually put these down a little bit. Or when you put it nested inside of a button, or an input, we actually have an exception for that, and it should follow these guidelines in any time that it's in one of these form elements, etc.
So a design system is kind of like a document, possibly with mock-ups of what the different types of user interface problems people will face. And
Yeah.
when they face those problems, then they come to the design system to have some direction. And this is something that would be primarily used by designers or maybe component library implementers to know, okay, so I need to build this sort of layout. It's going to have these things. Let me grab some pieces from the design system, this document that maybe has some mock-ups, so that I am consistent with our I can promote consistency in our design.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about having that is that it can extend beyond your tooling, right? So like you might have an artifact of that design system that lives purely for like Rails consumers, or React consumers, and they might be implemented with different technologies to take advantage of different, to optimize different user experiences. but then yeah, like having a separate thing that kind of mandates how those things are handled allows you to kind of have consistency in all of your artifacts, like all of those implementations that you would have. And
Yeah,
it's tough because like a lot of times it's like, it is about exception handling, and you know you can't just think long enough to manifest all of the exceptions. The exceptions come from actually building the product.
right. Yeah, that's true. Like it's an exception is a thing that you weren't expecting. Like it's so like by
Yeah.
definition, yeah, that makes total sense. And
Otherwise, it would
so
just
like
be expectations.
that's right. Yeah. So a design system is a living document. It's a thing that like evolves over time. That as these exceptions come up, so that
Yeah.
you handle more of those exceptions.
Yeah. And to answer your earlier question, if you are at a company that's just using React, I think that these things do kind of become one in the same. I think the concern that I have when I see, them being, what is it, conflated, is that at some point, if your company has the privilege of being around for more than like 3 years, there's gonna be a next framework that your engineers are super excited about, right? Like it will happen, and there's going to be like a next kind of design phase that your designers are really excited about. And when those things start to diverge and you mature as a company, and and they will, you're going to have, this question of like, okay, well, do we rewrite the whole thing in React, or in like React Next placeholder for a future framework? And also, like, do we remember why we have all of these like conditionals and like weird cases implemented in the code? Like, what was the reasoning for that? Like, we know what it looks like, but like, why did we make those decisions? And I think that being able to separate those is a long-term strategy. And like, maybe you don't, maybe you want to be out of the game in 3 years. And so like, yeah, just do React. That's fine.
Fair point. Part of me feels like React is the last UI framework. We were tweeting about this.
Yeah, we did talk about this.
Yeah. So for the benefit of those listening, that I feel like React might be the last framework we need to know, because before it falls out of style, the computers will be doing everything for us. So it will last long enough for the singularity.
Yeah,
We'll see.
Yeah, I do feel like React may be the last, and I think maybe we have like slightly different versions of like what will inevitably happen. But I do agree that I think that we will get very quickly to a point where designers can work in some type of design tool, and that will be good enough for like the front end of the UI, right? So you can like build it in the design tool, make your flows, make your designs and all that kind of stuff, and then like just Dreamweaver that crap to the web, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the job of engineers is going to change pretty significantly. Where I just don't know if we're going to have this division of like UX, UI, front end developer. Like I don't see a future, long-term future for all of those things being like three distinct roles. Like once you can commit code from a design tool, like that's just one person now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The real crux of it will be, can we get the computer to write the logic for us? Like,
Yeah.
The GPT-3 thing where you just say, I want this to do that.
Yeah.
And then like, I think it'll be a longer term thing before the computer can make a design that we like. And so
Yeah.
maybe you'll still have designers, but you can say, hey, AI, I want you to use these components and build this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I think that we'll definitely, I think we'll definitely get there, and I think that we need to be prepared for it. But I think the takeaway is the same. I think that we generally agree that React may be the last thing. Like whether it's AI, whether it's like better design tooling, like where we're at right now is probably gonna. I don't see an area where there's going to be like a new JavaScript framework. Maybe there's a Rust framework that we can write UI in, and it's amazing. But I don't know. I just don't see us writing another JavaScript framework that's significantly better than what we have
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah, I don't know. And like I could just be blinded or like in denial. But you know, React is older than jQuery was when React was announced. So
That's true.
it has some pretty solid staying power. Anyway, so I still want to hear about like how so you've got the design system. That's not actually using any web technologies to create that, right? Like this is
Right,
just
right.
like this is how we handle exceptions and whatever. So when we go around to actually implementing this in a technology that can be consumable and actually built with, like you probably want to avoid the situation where Team X and Team Y are both implementing the design system. You want
Yeah.
to have some way to share, you know, have Team Z be responsible for implementing this, and then Team X and Y can take advantage of you know, that shared skill and code. And so when I was at PayPal, this was like the last thing that I worked on was getting them on track to actually implement our design system into something that was shared across teams, which is really surprising to me that it hadn't already happened. Yeah, so I really fought for CSS and JS and was finally convinced that design systems or component libraries should actually be built on top of more generic the technologies, standardized technologies, just like regular
Yeah.
classes and stuff. But technology, even in the last few years, has really evolved, and the standards have evolved. And I'd love to hear your take on how we can leverage those standards to be really productive in building out these design systems.
Yeah, yeah. And I know that we're kind of like, I think we might be like just past our time, so I'll try to keep it brief. But
Yeah, we're
um,
good. We're good.
I really love, I really love standards. And I know that they move like super slow. And, you know, a lot of times you have stuff that you want to do that's on the edge. But I have always believed that, like, if you can kind of come back and carve out the things that, like, you don't need anymore and replace them with standards, or I guess replace the pieces that where standards have come up, like try to replace those pieces like as you can, as you're like working on your tooling and your frameworks and whatnot. I think a really interesting example of this is you know, Theme UI, and I think mostly for performance reasons, they actually spit everything out as custom properties. And I think that this is a really interesting marriage of like CSS and JS and, you know, using the standards of custom properties. Um, because it allows you to, I mean, there's a lot of things that you're going to get these browser performance like tuning like out of the box by using the standards, right? It's, you know, the browser is not concerned necessarily like with your framework and like the hottest Hacker News project, but it is concerned with making the standards like wicked fast, like as fast as possible. And I think that that is like something to concern yourself with when you are thinking about React tools. Like under the hood, is it kind of honoring the standards that are at play? And I think a lot of, you know, mature projects really try to do their best to acknowledge the standards and move to them as they can. Now, sometimes it's like, you know, you end up having to like cut out a lot of browser support, and that kind of limits the availability of these projects to you. But it's very much worth considering. Um, and I think that, you know, for those that have a like long vision for their the workability of their applications, you know, standards are great because they go with you from framework to framework, right? So every day I have to think about like, how can I provide the same tools to both React and Rails developers? And something I love about standards is that like they have no notion of either of those frameworks. And that's actually a really good thing. And the more that I can lean into those, the more both of those, you know, development environments will have consistency, and not consistency of design necessarily, but consistency of like that underlying implementation. And like as we make changes, we have more places that we can do that and offer that consistency and like share those abstractions kind of between, you know, sometimes like super disparate consumers. And yeah, I don't know, it's something that I'm super passionate about. And I think that there's a lot that we can do to I guess like make everybody happy. I think there's a part of me that like believes that like everyone can be opinionated and everyone can also be happy like sharing stuff. And that's what I love standards for, is that it's like, okay, like here's an area that kind of like moves slowly, but you know, this is something that, like pretty much all web developers kind of like agree on at this point. So like maybe let's just use that.
Yeah. I hate to bring this up, but I know that somebody is thinking about web components in this
Yeah,
context.
yeah.
And so actually, are you okay with just a 30-second thing on how web components plays into this?
Oh, of course, of course. I don't know.
That's
Yeah,
very
I don't know.
honest.
I think that for me, I wish that web components and React got along better. I know the reasons that they don't. Um, I wish that they did. It seems to me, as of right now, that web components really don't necessarily have a future. Um, and I don't know. I mean, we could talk about all the like reasons why the writing feels like it's on the wall or whatever, but I feel like React kind of destroyed any interest in web components. So I don't.
It certainly did for me. I'm I have zero interest in web components because I have React, and honestly, web components never seemed like a good way to build a full application. That was
Yeah,
my intuition, and then it was confirmed by the multiple companies that hired me to teach them React because web components weren't working for them.
yeah, yeah.
So
And I think that if I would love for them to have been the way that we share kind of atomic abstractions, right? Because that would
right,
be amazing. That would be truly amazing. Like to be able to kind of like build things that are like browser native and then build our applications in React. Like to have a
right.
standard for a component would be amazing. But it just didn't really get there kind of in the time before React kind of ate its lunch.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate, and I don't think that it's just because React doesn't work well with web components.
Yeah.
Um, I think that there's a failing on web components in the way that it was designed and implemented,
Yeah.
and which is I think because of those failings, the React team just became disinterested in
Yeah.
good compatibility, which is a crying shame. It is it is what it is. Um,
It is.
Michael, this has been a pleasure to chat with you
Always.
as always. Thank you so much for giving me some of your time today. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you want to just mention, throw out there really quick before we wrap up?
No, that's I think that's pretty much it. I just hope that, you know, you can be happy in the in the work that you're doing. I recommend standards for that like so much. I love them. Just embrace CSS, just love on it because it's so good. That's it.
Cool. Do you have any resources for folks who want to do that embracing?
Oh gosh, you know, if I was super smart and like business savvy, I would, but I don't.
Well, that's all right. There's
I think
MDN.
yeah, no, I mean like CSS Tricks is like a real classic. I mean, they have a
Mm,
ton of stuff on like, you know, their Flex and Grid resources are amazing. NDN is an awesome resource. I think that between those, you know, between those, you'll be able to find a lot of what you need to know. Um, and yeah, I think there's a lot of really good resources out there. I think it's mostly just about taking the time and like desire to actually go and be like, what are these like custom properties? Like now that I can use them, like why should I care?
yeah, that sounds great. And though, as the last thing, really quick, what if somebody wants to keep up with you and what you're up to? What's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so I am at Chantastic on like, you know, GitHub, Twitter, whatever. Instagram, I guess, though I don't even think I have it on my phone. And those are kind of like the best places. I'm kind of like in that zone with you right now where I'm kind of like a little bit over Twitter and like I'm thinking about doing like a Discord thing. But again, these are
Yeah.
just like ideas. I don't have anything to pitch right now, but I'm I'd like to get off Twitter and just have like reasonable conversations with people that I want to spend my day with.
Yeah, yeah, for real. And that's why we're gonna wrap this up and
Yeah.
run over to your family. And
Cool.
yeah,
Hey, thanks for having me on, Kent. This is always a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. And we'll see you everybody around the internet. Bye.